Tuesday, March 31st, 2026. The bluster has evaporated, replaced by the cold and undeniable reality of a geopolitical catastrophe. Behind closed doors, the current administration is reportedly in a state of sheer panic, actively preparing to abandon a conflict it initiated, a move that military historians are already framing as one of the most humiliating strategic defeats in modern American history. What I intend to analyze here is not the surface narrative of tactical adjustments and revised objectives that official statements have been offering. It is the structural reality underneath that narrative, what has actually been lost, what has actually been conceded, and what the political and strategic consequences of this unraveling will be for every party that participated in constructing it.
According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal, the commander-in-chief has explicitly instructed aides to find an immediate off-ramp to the Iranian conflict. The White House is searching for a way to conclude combat operations, even if that means permanently leaving the Strait of Hormuz in a state of total deadlock. Intelligence assessments have finally pierced the insulation around executive decision-making. Defense officials are now admitting what the operational picture has been indicating for weeks, that any forced military operation to reopen the strait would drag the United States into a prolonged and unwinnable engagement far beyond the initial 4 to 6 week timeline that shaped the original planning assumptions. The objective is no longer a triumphant conclusion. The administration is attempting to rebrand a full-scale retreat as a localized victory, claiming its new goal is simply the degradation of Iranian conventional military capabilities. Ground operations, once loudly championed as the ultimate solution to the strategic problem Iran presented, have been quietly removed from the priority list. What I observe in that rhetorical shift is not a strategic recalibration. It is the linguistic architecture of retreat being constructed in real time. And the construction is not subtle. Consider what modern warfare in 2026 actually looks like. The battle space is dominated by first-person view drone swarms, loitering munitions, and precision ballistic missiles. You cannot claim victory by defeating a conventional army that is systematically dismantling your infrastructure with advanced asymmetric technology. The claim that degrading Iranian conventional military capabilities constitutes a successful outcome is a claim that makes sense only if you ignore what Iranian forces have actually been using to impose costs on American operations, which is precisely the asymmetric toolkit that conventional military degradation does not address. Recall the confidence that radiated from Washington just weeks ago. The narrative was uncompromising in its ambition. Regime change was the objective. The Iranian public would flood the streets in gratitude. The nuclear program would be erased and the missile stockpiles obliterated. None of that materialized. Instead, what I observe is an administration moving the goalposts with a velocity that makes the original positions difficult to locate in the revised statements. The State Department's current directives, articulated by senior diplomats including Marco Rubio, outline entirely new and substantially downgraded objectives: destroying the Iranian Air Force, neutralizing the Navy, diminishing missile launching capabilities. The contradiction embedded in that formulation is not incidental. The president explicitly claimed within the past week that Iran's missile capabilities had already been fully obliterated. If that claim was accurate, there would be nothing left to diminish. If the new objective is to diminish what remains, the earlier claim was not accurate. What is entirely absent from the State Department's revised checklist is analytically as significant as what appears on it. Regime change, gone. Nuclear dismantlement, gone. Securing the Strait of Hormuz, gone. These were the foundational justifications for initiating this conflict. Their disappearance from the official objective list is not a refinement of strategy. It is an acknowledgement that the strategy has failed on its own stated terms, dressed in language designed to obscure that acknowledgement from domestic audiences. The strategic fallout of what has been set in motion is now operating independently of whatever decisions Washington makes next. The Iranian parliament has codified into law a claim of total sovereign ownership over the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is actively charging transit tolls to foreign allies while maintaining a complete blockade against the United States and Israel. What I observe in that development is the precise inversion of the stated American objective. The administration initiated this conflict with the explicit goal of ensuring the strait remained open and under the effective governance of international maritime law. The conflict's operational outcome has been to hand formal Iranian sovereignty over that passage, not as an informal exercise of power, but as a legislated claim that will now require active challenge to contest. By initiating this conflict, the administration handed control of the world's most critical energy artery directly to Tehran. The mechanism it used to try to prevent that outcome produced the outcome it was designed to prevent. Simultaneously, sanctions on both Iranian and Russian oil exports have effectively collapsed. If the administration's definition of winning involves massively empowering Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran, expanding their economic room to operate, consolidating their regional positioning, and demonstrating to every government watching that American military commitments do not translate into durable strategic outcomes, then what has been achieved here qualifies as a spectacular success by that inverted metric. For the United States and its allies, it is a different kind of result entirely. Tehran is not concealing its assessment of how this has unfolded. The Iranian Foreign Ministry has been mocking Washington on social media, sarcastically thanking the president for his threats and announcing that the strait is open exclusively for Chinese petroleum tankers. That statement is not merely political theater. It is a declaration of the new operational reality, one in which Chinese energy logistics flow through a passage that American military action was supposed to bring under more favorable governance, while American and Israeli shipping remains blocked. The diplomatic humiliation and the strategic substance are, in this case, the same thing. The ripple effects are tearing through Allied command structures in ways that are producing their own secondary consequences. The Israeli military is reportedly facing a catastrophic resource breakdown. Facing critical supply shortages, the IDF has abruptly shifted its operational focus away from hardened military targets and is directing fire toward Iranian civilian and economic infrastructure, specifically gas pipelines and steel plants. What I observe in that targeting shift is an institution that has exhausted its capacity to engage military targets at the operational tempo the conflict has demanded, and is now doing what militaries under unsustainable resource pressure tend to do: substituting available targets for optimal targets. Systematically targeting civilian energy and economic infrastructure is a grave violation of international humanitarian law. It also triggers an immediate symmetrical response. Iran has retaliated by striking the steel and energy infrastructure of its Arab neighbors when Allied forces struck academic science centers at Tehran University. Iran immediately threatened American universities in Qatar, forcing mass evacuations. The escalation logic is symmetrical and self-reinforcing, each crossing of a threshold by one side providing the justification for the other to cross the corresponding threshold on its side. 13 major United States military bases across the Middle East currently sit completely abandoned. Over the last 48 hours alone, Iranian precision strikes crippled a massive Kuwaiti oil tanker off the coast of Dubai and destroyed an oil depot in Haifa. The region is burning, and what I observe in the president's documented priorities during this period is a gap between the scale of the crisis and the focus of executive attention that has no modern parallel I can identify. His attention, according to multiple reports, is consumed by his plummeting domestic standing. The latest YouGov polling places his approval rating at 33%, historic depths of unpopularity for a wartime president. Rather than managing a global crisis whose dimensions are expanding daily, the commander-in-chief is publicly focused on constructing massive presidential libraries in Miami, placing his likeness on the $100 bill and designing ceremonial spaces. Military brass are openly appalled. Former top commanders from allied nations are publicly urging Washington to declare a face-saving victory formulation and stop the operational bleeding before the losses compound further. Retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Steve Anderson accurately characterized this as the greatest geopolitical disaster in the history of the country. But when Anderson dismisses the Iranian military as nothing more than committed religious fanatics, he commits a fatal analytical error that I want to address directly because it reflects a misunderstanding that has been present in Western assessments of Iranian capability throughout this conflict. This is not a disorganized insurgency operating on ideological motivation without institutional depth. Iran is a highly sophisticated, technologically advanced society. Despite the heavy repression of its government, its engineering and university sectors are world-class, producing the cutting-edge weaponry that is currently stalemating Western legacy systems at the operational level. To characterize Iranian military effectiveness as zealotry is to misidentify the source of the problem, and misidentifying the source of a problem makes solving it structurally impossible. Iran is executing a calculated long-term strategy of economic attrition. Its leadership has a precise understanding of how much pain global markets can absorb and where the political breaking points within allied coalitions are located. That is not fanaticism. That is sophisticated strategic planning operating on a timeline longer than the electoral cycles that constrain Western decision-making. The domestic political coalition that championed this conflict is officially fracturing. Die-hard loyalists and high-profile commentators who have defended this administration through every previous controversy are publicly denouncing the handling of the war. Supporters who backed the president for a decade are expressing public fury that their children are being deployed to fight a foreign war that directly contradicts the America First isolationism they were promised. And that formed the ideological foundation of the political movement they joined. The contradiction between the foreign policy posture this administration campaigned on and the expansive military commitment it has undertaken is not a nuance that requires sophisticated analysis to identify. It is visible, and it is generating political consequences that are now measurable in polling data. American priorities during this period are on display in ways that would be difficult to believe if they were not documented. While the Middle East destabilizes, military officials have been forced to open an investigation after two AH-64 Apache attack helicopters were deployed in Tennessee to intimidate domestic civilian protesters before landing at the private residence of a musician for a photo opportunity. The institutional damage that deployment represents to the credibility of military command, to the principle that military assets serve national security functions rather than political ones, is not separable from the broader picture of an administration that has lost coherent strategic focus. The administration is searching for the emergency exit, but the door is locked from the outside, and the parties holding the key are not sympathetic to the administration's timeline. The Arab nations that partnered with Washington, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, are issuing a stark ultimatum. They invested heavily in the current administration, channeling billions into sovereign wealth funds connected to the president's private financial interests. They purchased a security umbrella. Now that their domestic infrastructure is being struck by Iranian missiles, they are communicating to Washington with unmistakable clarity: you cannot abandon us. If the United States attempts to withdraw, the Gulf states will have no choice but to construct a new security architecture, and the parties positioned to broker that new regional order are Russia and China. The same Russia whose targeting intelligence has been guiding Iranian strikes against American aviation assets, and the same China whose petroleum tankers are now transiting a strait that American military action was supposed to keep open on different terms. What I observe in the full arc of what has unfolded between the confident declarations of weeks ago and the panic reported inside the White House today is a strategic trajectory that was visible in its outlines from the moment the gap between the stated objectives and the available instruments became apparent. Regime change requires either the cooperation of the population being liberated or the physical occupation of the territory being transformed. Neither condition was present. Securing the Strait of Hormuz through military action against the power that controls its northern shore requires either defeating that power comprehensively or negotiating terms it will accept. Neither path was pursued with the resources or the sustained commitment that either would require. and degrading Iranian military capability through air power alone against an adversary that has deliberately built its strategic deterrent around asymmetric systems that air power cannot efficiently neutralize, produces the result now visible: a degraded but functional Iranian conventional force operating alongside an intact and battle-tested asymmetric capability that has demonstrated its effectiveness against the most expensive military assets the United States deploys. The off-ramp the administration is searching for does not exist in the form it is hoping to find. There is no formulation of words that converts the current strategic position into a credible victory claim for audiences that have been watching the operational record accumulate. There is no diplomatic arrangement available that restores the pre-conflict status of the Strait of Hormuz without Iranian cooperation. And Iranian cooperation will not be secured on terms that the administration can present domestically as a success. The choices remaining are between different varieties of a difficult outcome, not between a difficult outcome and a favorable one. That is the condition that strategic miscalculation at the level I have been analyzing here produces. And it is the condition that will define American foreign policy positioning, Allied confidence in American commitments, and the regional order of the Middle East for the period that follows whatever conclusion this conflict eventually reaches. The period that follows will not be a return to the conditions that preceded this conflict. That point deserves emphasis because the instinct of governments emerging from failed military campaigns is typically to treat the post-conflict environment as a restoration project, to identify what existed before and work toward reconstructing it. That instinct is understandable. It is also, in this case, analytically incorrect. The conditions that existed before this conflict began cannot be reconstructed because the conflict has permanently altered the factors that produce them. The American security umbrella that covered the Gulf region for decades rested on two foundations: the demonstrated willingness to use military force to protect Allied interests and the demonstrated capability to do so effectively. Both foundations have been damaged by what has unfolded. The willingness is now in question because the administration is visibly searching for an exit from a commitment it made publicly and recently. The capability is now in question because the operational record, the destroyed command aircraft, the abandoned bases, the inability to reopen the strait, the retreat from stated objectives one by one, is a public record that every government in the region has been reading in real time and drawing its own conclusions from. Willingness and capability are the two components of deterrence. When both are simultaneously in question, the deterrent value of the security guarantee collapses, and a security guarantee whose deterrent value has collapsed is not a guarantee. It is a statement of intention that adversaries have learned to discount. The Gulf states understand this with a clarity that their public statements are designed to obscure. The ultimatum they are issuing to Washington, "Do not abandon us or we will seek alternative security arrangements," is not a negotiating position. It is a description of the strategic calculation they are already making. The sovereign wealth fund investments they channeled into the current administration's financial orbit were not philanthropy. They were the purchase of a security relationship they believed would be durable. The durability of that relationship is now the central question of Gulf state foreign policy. And the answer they are arriving at is producing conversations with Moscow and Beijing that would have been inconceivable under the security architecture that existed before February of this year. Russia's position at the conclusion of this conflict will be materially stronger than its position at the beginning, regardless of the military outcome on the ground in the Middle East. Russian targeting intelligence guided Iranian strikes against American aviation assets. Russian oil exports have benefited from the collapse of sanctions. Russian diplomatic positioning in the Gulf has been enhanced by the demonstrated unreliability of the American alternative. Moscow has absorbed none of the military costs of this conflict and collected a substantial portion of its strategic benefits. That outcome was not accidental. It reflects a Russian strategic calculus that identified the conflict as an opportunity to impose costs on American global positioning without deploying Russian forces, to use Iranian capability, Iranian geography, and Iranian willingness to absorb military punishment as instruments of Russian strategic interest. The intelligence sharing arrangement that made Prince Sultan possible was not a gesture of solidarity with Tehran. It was a precisely calibrated investment in an outcome that serves Moscow's long-term interest in a diminished American presence in the Middle East and a fractured American relationship with Gulf energy producers. China's position is similarly enhanced. The Iranian Foreign Ministry's announcement that the strait is open exclusively for Chinese petroleum tankers was not improvised rhetoric. It was the public declaration of an arrangement that reflects months of diplomatic preparation and that gives Beijing privileged access to Gulf energy flows at precisely the moment when that access is being denied to American and Israeli shipping. China has secured through Iranian proxy action that it did not have to initiate or sustain a preferential energy logistics position that it could not have negotiated through conventional diplomacy. The cost to China of this outcome was negligible. The strategic benefit is substantial and durable. What I observe when I position all of these developments within the longer arc of American global positioning is a moment that historians will likely identify as a genuine inflection point, not because of the specific military losses at Prince Sultan or the specific diplomatic failures over the strait, but because of what those losses and failures reveal about the gap between the assumptions on which American strategic primacy has rested and the operational reality that those assumptions now face. The assumption that American air power could dominate any theater against any adversary shattered. The assumption that military commitments made by Washington carry durable credibility with allied governments damaged. The assumption that economic pressure through sanctions could be maintained while military action was conducted, falsified by the collapse of the sanctions architecture. The assumption that the political coalition supporting an aggressive foreign policy posture would remain coherent through the operational difficulties of an actual war, fractured by the polling data and the public defections now visible within the administration's own base.